67 Sharon Road was the home of the Connecticut School for Imbeciles, one of the nation's earliest institutions designed to take care for children with mental disabilities. But this place's historical importance extends far beyond rural Connecticut. Dr. Henry M. Knight, a physician who works in the town of Salisbury in the 1850s during a period known as the Second Great Awakening.
When Dr. Henry Knight founded the school, it was very much out of religious benevolence. He was very much into the Great Awakening. That's the time frame that he grew up, and so that's what he believed in.
Today, the word imbecile is rightly considered to be derogatory. While acknowledging this, we have still decided to include it so we can be historically accurate and quote historical documents. The term, however, was neither scientific nor accurate. At various times in the 1800s, this category encompassed people with Down syndrome and autism to a wide range of other disorders: feeble-mindedness, schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, otherwise known as bipolar disorder, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, genetic blindness, deafness, severe hereditary physical deformity, and chronic alcoholism were among the many disorders that fell under the term's umbrella. Noting the growing number of diagnoses and having been energized by the spirits of the Second Great Awakening, Knight designed a school to teach these children skills so they can assimilate into society. By teaching these children practical and basic household tasks that would be helpful in rural settings like chopping wood and sewing. He feels this is so important that he opens up his home to these children, starting off with one and increasing it to over a dozen. In 1861, he convinced the state legislature to help, and it is incorporated by the state and referred to as the Connecticut School for Imbeciles. With growing success and much public acclaim, Knight continues to run the school until his death in 1880. 5 years following Henry Knight's death, his eldest son, George, assumes the role of school superintendent. George's studies at Yale coincided with the development of the eugenics movement in America. Many supporters of eugenics also believe that sterilization and the segregation of society's unfit population will ensure the purity and superiority of future generations. George adopts this ideology and capitalizes on his experience living with his father to help develop a similar institution in Faribault, Minnesota, all of which is done prior to making his way back to Connecticut, where he assumes his father's role as superintendent. His appointment comes at a time when crime rates continue to skyrocket through Connecticut. George, however, has a strategy to resolve this problem. He believes that individuals with mental disabilities are responsible for the increase in crime. However, unlike his father, George decides that the answer is not to help assimilate the mentally disabled, but rather to segregate and even eliminate them altogether.
He actually did get into colonization. George was, if you look at George's speeches at the World's Fairs, they did change from being in a family atmosphere to more toward colonization, and not letting the students back out, so basically institutionalization as we think of it today.
In the 1895 Connecticut School for Imbeciles annual report, George writes, "I am well aware that segregation and sterilization carried out would strike a blow directly at the root of what is called the law of individual right. But I claim that the mentally unfit have no individual right to reproduce themselves." George uses his growing stature to become elected to the Connecticut state legislature, where he helps craft legislation like an act concerning operations for the prevention of procreation. This grants state-run hospitals in Connecticut the legal jurisdiction to sterilize individuals it deems unfit. This law was one of the nation's first laws of its kind, but 31 states still enforce similar laws to this day. George also played a role in passing a marriage ban in 1896, making the state of Connecticut the first to formally ban the marrying of so-called imbeciles. George writes, "Nobody wants the imbecile, not even those who are bound most closely to him by ties of blood. He is an innocent element of disorder everywhere outside of associations with his own kind." We were fortunate enough to visit Beinecke's Rare Books and Manuscripts library, when we shockingly discovered how wide George's message had spread. Agents of Nazi Germany also traveled to New Haven, Connecticut, and modeled their laws for the prevention of progeny with hereditary diseases after the work of George Knight and other proponents of eugenics. As part of Hitler's sterilization and emasculation program, individuals subject to the law were men and women who were determined to be suffering from imbecility. In 1912, George collapses and dies during a town meeting only a short distance from his home, leaving his wife, Kate, in charge of the school. Later, the state of Connecticut takes over control of the school and moves it to Eastern Connecticut, where it is incorporated as part of the Mansfield Training School and Hospital, which becomes quite notorious in the 1980s, before ultimately shutting down in 1993. The building was taken over by the University of Connecticut and still stands there to this day. George's legacy does not end with the closing of his school, however. We know you're thinking, how does Knight relate to the federally protected right to buy birth control? How can he possibly be connected to Britney Spears? In 1965, during the Griswold versus Connecticut lawsuit, the Supreme Court overturns the Connecticut law prohibiting contraceptive use. The Supreme Court invalidated a Connecticut law that makes it a crime to use birth control devices or to advise anyone about their use. Planned Parenthood specifically cites Knight's law in their argument, basically saying that if the state could make decisions regarding contraception, individuals should also have that right. The Supreme Court agrees in a 7-2 decision overturning Connecticut's law. Some 100 years after Knight's death, pop singer Britney Spears underwent a forced sterilization of her own. In the early 2000s, and after a series of erratic public encounters, Spears' father convinced the state of California to appoint him as a conservator. In that role, Spears' father requested the application of an IUD to prevent his daughter from having children. As the pop singer shared her plight, the Free Britney movement was born. Forcing someone to be on birth control against their will is a violation of basic human rights and bodily autonomy, just as forcing someone to become or stay pregnant against their will would be. In the 1927 case, Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court upheld the right to sterilize a feeble-minded woman who had been admitted to a state mental institution. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes infamously writes, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." One of the reasons why this history is so relatively unknown is because historical topics like mental illnesses have been neglected in the past because of societal stigma and discomfort around the topic. Mental illness has often been seen as a taboo subject, something to be hidden and not discussed openly. This lack of open dialogue has perpetuated the discrimination and marginalization of those with mental illness, making it difficult for individuals to seek the help they need without fear of judgment or ostracization. This hidden address in Lakeville speaks to humanity's capacity for good and evil. In a house tucked away in the grassy hills of northwest Connecticut, the nature of right and wrong rests within its wooden walls and complex past. The School for Imbeciles is not only a representation of discrimination, but it is also a lesson of hope and benevolence. Learning the whole story allows us to learn from the past and shine a light on a pathway for a healthier and more inclusive future.